could you keep an eye on that and let me know if it stops recording?
Can do.
Should be fine.
I'll also tell you if a battery runs out.
That'd be great. I do have
I can do two things at once.
I do actually have extra battery. It should be fine. Right, part one.
Okay, so I'll just do a bit of introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the SKBI seminar series. So today we have Vinay Gupta here talking to us about the developments of Ethereum and beyond. So we had a series of talks on Bitcoin and blockchain, and the big issue that has been coming up recently is how do we use blockchain and how do we use the blockchain technology. Like governments, banks have been telling us they want to experiment with it. So Ethereum is one of the leading people behind looking at blockchain technology. So today we have Vinay here with us. He is the release coordinator for Ethereum. And he's in Singapore talking to regulators as well, right? And discussing with them the blockchain technology and Ethereum. So without, I think we're running a bit late, so without further ado, let's welcome Vinay. Yes.
So, let me get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you actually know how to program an Ethereum contract? Okay. How many of you could stand up and give a kind of rough description of how Ethereum works? Okay. How many of you plan to develop a serious project on Ethereum, whether academic or commercial? Okay, so should I start at the very beginning and we can talk about what Ethereum is and then we can go from there? That'd be a good way of doing this? Okay, what about Bitcoin knowledge? How many of you have a pretty good grasp of Bitcoin? Yeah, half of you? Something like that? How many of you program computers for money? Okay, a few business, finance, that kind of stuff? Okay. Come in. We haven't started yet.
I'm sorry about it.
Right, okay, we'll just have to use the audio of the camera. So, okay, these things happen. So, let me start at the beginning with why all of this stuff matters. Right? Does anybody have a simple, clear, comprehensive definition of what money is? Yes, tell me what money is.
Money is a medium to exchange services between people.
Okay. Is everything that is a medium to exchange services money?
No, I mean we can segregate the definition with storage of value, but value itself derives from the fact that human people want to exchange services between each other.
Okay. So does that sound like it defines all instances of money? Or does it only define most instances? Is everything that anybody will ever call money included in that definition, or are there other definitions that might be used for different things?
It's your code.
Right. So my experience with this is that all definitions of money tend to reflect the culture and the cultural understanding of the person doing the defining. So there is a standard kind of economics perspective on money, that it's medium of exchange, store of value, and a few other things. But when you actually look around, all of those functions exist in other places. And in the past, there's been lots of contention about whether specific things were or weren't money. So for a long time, we agreed that gold was money. Now people will say that gold is a commodity, and the gold only becomes money when you stamp the face of a king on it and stop people using other forms of gold. All of this kind of stuff. Debasing of currency. People used to think that the gold was what gave the currency value, then they started putting other stuff into the gold and the currency currencies became debased. Okay, well, maybe money is what the king says it is. Then we pull the metals out of circulation entirely, and we get the kind of American dollar, which is now backed largely by guesswork and vapor. So the definition of money, I think, is socially constructed, and we continue to redefine money in whatever way seems useful to us on the day that we happen to be doing the defining. I think this is really important to understand at a fundamental level, because once we admit that as society changes, the definition of money tends to change with it, we're prepared to deal with the 21st century, which is shaping up to be one of the weirdest centuries in human history. Like, it's going to be as weird as when we discovered agriculture or discovered fire. Right? You know, people are legitimately speculating about what human lifespan will be at the beginning of the 22nd century in centuries. Right? And I think it's very hard, given that in 1900 American life expectancy was 45, and in 2000 American life expectancy was 90, to suggest that life expectancy is going to remain static for the next century. So we're dealing with a position where we can reasonably expect an enormous extension of human life within our lifespans, and all kinds of enormous shifts in our technological base, computer power multiplying by 1 million every 20 years, all of these processes running simultaneously. The idea that you can take, you know, bits of paper, or in this case plastic, right, backed by the promise of the nation state to be a fundamental, final form of money doesn't make any sense at all. Right? I mean, we used that stuff for a long time, and you know, now we have these things, and you know, these things can interface onto state money, they can interface onto Bitcoin, they can interface onto damn near anything. Somehow, this is just an interface device to computer systems that use that as an endpoint. So, the place I want to start by talking about this is by getting a clear understanding that money is whatever people use and call money. Trying to get a fundamental definition of money, which is true across all cultures at all times, is like trying to get a fundamental definition of love, which is true in all cultures at all times. It really does depend. Once we accept that we've got this kind of uncontrolled, rampant technological acceleration, and we've got constant change in the way that the state and the citizens relate to each other, and the way that the citizens relate to each other as well, never mind the relationship between states, it becomes easier to say what money has been than to say what money will be. Do we really believe that it will be paper currency in 50 years? If not, if it's not going to be paper currency in 50 years, where does paper currency stop working? In an age when you've got recovery of gold from seawater or asteroid mining or any of this kind of stuff going on, what does that tell us about the ability of gold to hold value? Because if you decide that you're going to go do asteroid mining on a large scale, gold very rapidly becomes a non-scarce thing. What do we do if gold becomes as common as aluminium? You guys know, by the way, that there was a period in which aluminium was vastly more expensive than gold. It didn't last very long, but you know, relative values of all the assets continue to fluctuate depending on the technological base and the social base. So how is it exactly that we're going to keep some kind of fundamental clarity about what value is? It can only be socially constructed. And if it's socially constructed in an age where lifespan is reasonably expected to double, and you've got this massive discontinuity in the technological base with all of the acceleration that goes with it, it seems fairly obvious that money is going to change in a fundamental way. And if it doesn't, it will be the only thing in the environment that isn't changing during what's shaping up to be a century of amazing changes. So this is where I kind of like to begin the thinking, to say that fundamentally, given that everything is changing, a lot of it is changing in an accelerating way, why would we expect cash to stay static? Once we accept that as a kind of starting point, then we can look at Bitcoin in a proper historical context. We invent the internet, we move books onto the internet. We invent the internet, we move music onto the internet. You get Amazon, you get the Kindle, you get iTunes. At some point, somebody says, let's move money onto the internet. First attempt is a thing called e-gold. Has anybody ever heard of e-gold? Ah, e-gold, good old days, right? E-gold was where I got my intro into all this stuff. I put about 1% of the transaction value through the e-gold system in '99, and have frankly never recovered. So, e-gold was a very simple system started by a dentist, doctor anyway, in Florida, called Doug Jackson. And Jackson was a gold bug, and he had an Excel spreadsheet at home, and if you mailed him gold coins, he'd add them to your row in the spreadsheet. And if you called him again and said, give the value of my gold coins to one of my mates, he would just move a couple of rows around and they now owed your gold. And if you asked him to send you your gold, he'd send you your coins back. But they might be different coins. You know, you might have sent him 10 1-ounce coins, and he'd send you back a 10-ounce bar. But value in the system was preserved, minus some transaction fees at Doug 2. And you can kind of see how this works, right? It's an account-based system that runs on gold. Your account is demarcated in grams. Everything's lovely. By the time they got whacked by the US government for banking without a license, they had $80 million of gold reserves, millions of customers. You could move $100,000 worth of value from one side of the world to the other using a cell phone, and it would cost you 50 cents. And it was efficient for micropayments down to a third of a penny. They had users in just about every country in the world, and I seem to remember at the time their total sort of transactional volume through the system was equal to about the GDP of Tanzania, because the money moved extremely fast. So, you know, by any reasonable standard, that was an extremely successful payment system. And in an environment with slightly more technical support and a better regulatory environment, there's no doubt at all the e-gold would have been the first wave of real internet money. It was international, everybody agreed on the value, it was compatible with Islamic finance to a pretty substantial degree. I mean, it really was a universal money system. The only problem was they started it in a country that was really all about the dollar and wasn't going to let anybody do any of this gold nonsense. So, a few years pass, and the decentralization revolution begins with Bitcoin. I think there's a pretty good chance that Bitcoin was funded by veterans of the e-gold system. There are a whole bunch of little kind of footprints on a lot of the stuff written by Satoshi that sort of indicate that he was at the very least extremely familiar with e-gold, even if he was not 100% a member of the core team. But my guess is he was somewhere very close inside of that community. So once you agree that centralized systems that attempt to operate outside of the state are inherently fragile, you get around to this idea of Byzantine consensus, right? We're going to spread the system out all over the world, and as long as most of the system agrees on what the status is of the system, then we have a consensus system. And if you and I both agree that my bank balance is 50 quid and your bank balance is 35, these things become facts. If everybody involved agrees on what something is, that thing is now true. The problem is that you can't have a consensus system which is based on physical assets. So if you're in the gold economy, you can have auditors that will physically turn up, look at your pile of gold in the vault, verify that the bars weigh what they ought to weigh, please. And there's no problem at all with doing that. It's how the entire gold economy works. Right? Once you step outside of gold as an economic unit, the question then is, if we've got lots of people with computers all over the world cooperating and trying to make something that looks like a currency, how do you verify what the value is? Even if everybody agrees on the rules of the game, how do we make sure that we all agree on where the pieces are on the board? And to get there, the Satoshi community, because I don't think that was an individual, but that group of people, whoever they were, basically produce a thing which is more or less a summary of everything that we know about cryptography up to about 2004. So it's got hash cache, it's got chained, chained hashes. It's got digital signatures. It's got a whole bunch of complicated game theory stuff in it. It's this enormous, almost like a lexicon of stuff in computer science, wedged end to end to end to end to end to end to end into this rough-hewn arch that we call Bitcoin. And the miracle of Bitcoin is that all of these crazy pieces of computer science, when you stack them up just about right, form a structure which is stable enough to have supported market value, market cap of what, $4 billion? Which, for a bunch of software to have become $4.5 billion, not based on the likelihood that it would earn more money in the future like a .com, but based on the inherent value of the tokens that it had generated, is truly remarkable. Right? I mean, it's not selling an experience like Warcraft, it's not a tracking currency for an underlying asset, it's a thing whose actual use value to the community that owned it was at $4.5 billion not so long ago. Does anybody know what the Bitcoin price is right now, by the way? It was on kind of a run the last time we checked.
Yeah, it's over 300 now.
Over 300 now. See, that's quite good, isn't it? I'm quite pleased to hear that, actually.
People blame Greece.
Well, I mean, if Bitcoin goes up every time there's trouble in the world, it's a sure sign that it's a currency. It's become like gold, it's got some reserve qualities. So, Bitcoin is a fabulous thing. As time begins to pass, people begin to want to do more and more complicated and interesting stuff with Bitcoin. This is where the problems begin to bite us in the ass. Right? So the worst problem with Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is just a currency. And it turns out that to get really interesting stuff to happen in the world, just the currency is not enough. You need things like auctions, you need things like futures contracts, you need derivatives, you need regular contracts, you need all kinds of other things. And Bitcoin doesn't provide the facilities for building those kinds of other things. So what happens with Bitcoin is you get these very secure payments that get connected directly to only kind of sort of secure shopping carts. So the payments, once they're made, are final, they're anonymous, kinda, and all the rest of that stuff. But the shopping cart that is taking those payments is as hackable as any website is. So you can have all your Bitcoin stuff nicely set up, and then somebody cracks your web server, nicks your secret keys, and then nicks all of your money. And all the way through the Bitcoin economy, there's been raid after raid after raid after raid, where people have lost millions or tens of millions of dollars because the systems around Bitcoin are fundamentally less secure than the Bitcoin is. So what's happening is that your attackers basically go, they're not going to go through the front door, they're going to step around to the side and come through the back. And that approach is extremely difficult to defeat as long as your system has a border. Right? And if the system has a border, then the border is going to be something which is weaker than strong cryptography because everything is weaker than strong cryptography, and your attackers just come in from the back, bam. So part of the motivation behind Ethereum is to try and build a closed system in which everything is as secure as the strong cryptography is. So if you need to run programs to actually execute trades or to run shopping carts or to run auctions or to be futures and derivatives and all the rest of that, then the programs have to run in an environment which is continuous with the underlying payment layer. You can't have a fault line where one thing turns into another thing and attackers slip a blade between the two and pry it open. You need it to be a continuous surface with no joints, which means you have to take the software and you have to put it directly into the same mechanism that stores the value. And this is Ethereum. Ethereum is a blockchain, so it's a distributed database, much like Bitcoin is, but it's a blockchain that stores software. And the software has the ability to make decisions on behalf of its users, and those decisions can execute a wide variety of financial operations and other things. Now, that jump of storing software on a blockchain rather than just transactions was incredibly radical when Vitalik made the jump. It was this aha moment, and everybody who looked at that said, obviously the right idea, follow that man. And here we are, right? 50 of us. Plus all of our donors who put money into the system to enable us to build Ethereum. We are now close to launch, right? Very close, like close enough that I'm almost made the mistake of giving you what I think is the current date. So it's really quite close. The issue list has gotten down to very, very small numbers. It's basically all done bar the eye roll at this point. So what's going to happen when we launch Ethereum for the first month or two is probably not very much. The hope is that we will stand the system up. Lots of people that are betting software right now on the test networks will load their stuff up onto the network. They'll begin to offer some services, and we will slowly make sure that everything's behaving exactly the way we think it ought to behave. So the hope is that it will be a slow, soft launch. In actual practice, there's a decent chance that it will be all over the newspapers. CNN will go, wow, this is amazing. Enormous numbers of people will pile in, and then exchange infrastructure will collapse, or our technical support lines will be overwhelmed, and it will turn into exactly the kind of mess that you expect when the entire world piles through a doorway this wide. So we're hoping for a soft launch. If it turns out to be a hard launch, I'm fairly sure that the software will stand up, because the software is very strong. The rest of the architecture around the software may have issues, right? Because it takes time to build human organizations, but Ethereum will scale to pretty much whatever size people decide that they're going to build on top of it. Shortly after that, probably another month or two after that, we'll have the actual launch, which will be a thing called Homestead. And that's the version of Ethereum that we recommend that people actually go out and tell your customers you're ready to do business, get over here and start trading. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how you get at Ethereum. So I mentioned that the blockchain is running software, but what this actually looks like is a program running on your computer with no user interface at all. And if you want to talk to it, you have to bring up a command line interface and you type commands to it in all things JavaScript. This is a fundamentally nerd-oriented product. It has no relevance at all to the vast majority of potential users. The way that you talk to Ethereum is through websites. And the strongest, most secure way of doing that is to have a thing called Node running on your computer with Ethereum on one side and a web browser on the other. You download applications and run them in that environment. But that arrangement, again, opens up these little security chinks, because if somebody hacks your laptop, they could get in between these components talking to each other and cause trouble. So the next step on the path of Ethereum is a thing that we call Metropolis. And Metropolis is a web browser which contains all of the Ethereum backend stuff internally, so that you have a single integrated application which provides all of the nice user interface and display and kind of website features, at the same time as having a secure engine inside of it which manages your interface to the blockchain. So at the point where we get to Metropolis, what you'll be left with is a secure execution environment for code which talks to a globally distributed shared database, which gives you the ability to access things which look exactly like websites but are impossible to censor or shut down, and are connected to a kind of internet of value, so you can trade with people on the other side of the world using those interfaces. That is going to be kind of a big deal. I expect that we're going to see Metropolis next year. I think you'll see some decent alphas of Metropolis late this year, but I think the actual release version is probably going to be into next year. Metropolis is very much what we envisaged Ethereum to be from the beginning, but with any project this complex, you have to ship in slices. If you put everything together into a single package and then try and drop that initially, in all probability there'll be some unforeseen problem and it will fail. You have to build the complexity incrementally, otherwise the system simply become overwhelmed. After Metropolis, there is ambition to produce a thing by the name of Serenity, and Serenity is a fundamental break in where we've been and where we're going. So up until now, all of these systems have been secured by proof of work. And proof of work is essentially, we've done such an enormous amount of computation in layers so that you can't modify the layer underneath without changing everything that comes afterwards, that anybody that wants to undo all of that and fake history has to do more compute than has been done in the entire Bitcoin system to date. And that's widely understood to be intractable, given that the hash rate, the speed of the Bitcoin network, is something like 500 times the speed of the top 100 supercomputer. It's an astonishingly fast network because it's got warehouses and warehouses and warehouses of cunningly designed custom hardware grinding off in the background, mostly in China at this point. So the problem with proof of work as an approach is it just generates an enormous amount of expense which drains value out of the network all the time because you have to pay for the electricity. What you really want is to keep all of that value in the network rather than feeding it to electricity companies to warm the atmosphere with. And to do that, you need to move to a different algorithm, which we call proof of stake. So proof of work operates by me proving that I have done the right thing by burning all of this electricity. Proof of stake, on the other hand, has you pledge some of the contents of your bank account that you will do the right thing. So essentially what happens is that a piece of computation or a contract comes to you, you run the contract, you write down what the output of the contract is, and then you bet the bank account that that's the right answer, and then you put it back into the system. And if you're honest, everybody else will agree with you, and at that point you will all get a nickel and you will all have gotten a reward for your labour. If, on the other hand, you're a fraudster, you take the contract, you write down that the result of the contract is the opposite of what it should be, and then you put it back into the pile, and because it is different from all the others, you then lose your deposit. And that sort of an approach is almost like a sort of shareholder democracy. You have a situation in which all of the people with accounts make what are essentially interest payments on their accounts, because they're constantly doing the work of evaluating other people's contracts, and because there's a consensus about what is true, we agree that that contract had this output, and everybody that agreed with that is rewarded. This is kind of like what they call a Schelling point. So that process produces a system in which everybody that has money will receive small payments for using that money to ensure that the system is running in an honest way. It gets away from the computational radiators, it gets away from the associated global warming, and it should increase the speed of the systems remarkably. It's also a building block on the path to a thing called blockchain scaling, which is even more exciting. So, does anybody know roughly how fast the Bitcoin network goes in terms of transactions per second? 7? Heard somewhere 12? Those kind of numbers, right? It's really not very fast. Does anybody own a computing device which is so slow that it only does 7 transactions a second? I mean, I had a ZX81 in about 1981. I am pretty sure that if I gave it transactions to do, it could manage a few hundred a second. Pretty sure. Certainly a few dozen a second. So we're dealing with a system which, although it's extremely secure, is slower than the slowest microcomputers that you were ever able to buy for the whole thing. And this is slightly ridiculous, like something is clearly wrong here. That's happening because this is a very, very, very early stage product. Bitcoin is like the first computers that have tape drives in them. It's the first hard drive. It's a really, really, really simple system, albeit very complicated. When it was first created, it's pretty easy to see that it's just a brick in a wall. So, what what blockchain scaling hopes to do is to create a transactional network which, instead of only getting more secure when you add more computers to it, actually gets faster. So, sort of notionally, you find a way of dividing the network up into zones. Each zone runs sort of independently for a while, so they're all running in parallel, and then you unify all the results from all the zones into a single consistent version of history. And if that sounds a bit fiddly, it's because it's a bit fiddly. Right? Blockchain scaling is a proper hard computer science question. I sometimes wonder exactly how they're going to make that work. I've got some background in parallel computing, and blockchain scaling is daunting. That's a really hard problem. But I think they're smart guys. I think they're going to pull it off. And at that point, what blockchain scaling buys you is blockchain technology that competes with things like Amazon Web Services or Google's App Engine in the market for large-scale, fast computation. Boy, that sounds interesting, doesn't it? To go from this extremely slow system that just crunches financial transactions in a few years to a computer where every time you add more computers to it, it gets even faster. That begins to sound like you might be able to challenge things like Visa in, say, 4 or 5 years. Because if you have 20 million people leaving their laptops on all night running Ethereum, you start doing the back of the envelope, and that's $1,000 a laptop. So 20 million, 200 million, 2 billion, 20 billion. Well, that's $20 billion worth of computers. Wow. And you begin to think, can Google afford to spend 20 billion a year on computers? Probably not. Visa? Probably not. So you might get this situation in which all of us together have a shared computing resource which is vastly more powerful than any single entity in the world. And if we can figure that out, it might be that we can generate a sort of secure free internet that nobody else is large enough to overturn. And if we get there, what we've successfully implemented is a kind of communications democracy. And I think that we all agree that that would be a very good goal point. So today currency, right, in a month or so contract, and if we keep it together, we might manage to get a secure free internet for everybody. I think I will leave it there, take some questions, and maybe if people want more depth on something, I might talk for another 5 minutes in a while about anything that is left unresolved. Okay, questions? Okay. Lots of questions, right.
So where does the program actually run?
Right. So, everywhere. All of the nodes run the program, agree on what the output of the program was, and then write themselves back to the blockchain. Jacqueline Green?
What is exactly the contract?
Okay. So smart contract is a terrible term. It's an old term, and it's an accurate term, but it's still a terrible term. What I mean by smart contract is function. It's a function that's stored on the blockchain. It's got access to some variables because it's in the blockchain, and we know who put it there, and a few other bits and pieces. And when the function executes, it can write stuff back to the blockchain, but it's just a function.
Yeah, actually I was doing that. I figured out it is when I compared to Java programming, and I found it is a similar like a class where I store my behavior of the class. But why we need to store the behavior of the like contract, and which we need to decrypt and store in the Ethereum? What is the purpose? Because we are usually we say the Ethereum, when you talk about that, it is like a blockchain database where you want to be centralized for information or transaction details. Then why, instead of keeping the transaction, why we need to store my program logic or my business logic in the Ethereum?
Okay, so the question is, why do we need to store the program logic in the blockchain? So the answer is, to do something like a futures contract, if you and I agree that if the price of the dollar is greater than the price of the euro, I'll pay you 50 quid, right? When you and I agree that, we write that agreement into the blockchain. So that's what makes it a contract. What makes it a contract is that everybody can see we've written that into the blockchain, and on the day that contract is evaluated, if it's evaluated in my favor, the money is automatically moved to me. So as soon as we've made the agreement and pushed it into the blockchain, that's it, it's a done deal. Come in, guys, we're just going to do it.
We're using contract in the legal sense now.
No, we're still talking smart contracts.
So
So, function, right? So we take a function and we upload it into the blockchain, it reflects the agreement we have. Because it's in the blockchain, it can't be disputed later on. And it automatically executes in the blockchain to move the value from one place to another.
Okay. However, this kind of logic keeps changing with the time, usually.
Yes.
So how about then?
When you need a new contract, you upload a new contract. I mean, it's a very, very simple instrument. It's not a, the system is not fundamentally sophisticated right now. The contracts are small objects. You put them in the blockchain, they run, they move value around. Job's good. It's not in the same class as things like OLTP systems inside of Visa. It's not like the kind of intelligence that runs inside of Google. They're basically just small chunks of code that make simple decisions and move value around. And they could be more complicated than that, but not yet. So another question. Yes. Oh, sorry. Behind the motion.
Just a quick question. I see that you are hesitating between proof of work and proof of stake.
Yes.
And I'm wondering why you don't consider that protocols like Ripple, based on consensus, could solve the problem also in a very efficient way without the problems inherent to proof of stake and proof of work.
The problem, as I understand it with Ripple, is that the number of people forming the consensus is limited. Right? So in a Ripple system, you've got a set of people that are like a jury, and they decide what's happening. We really don't want that. We want something which gets more and more and more users who all have equal rights inside of the system. So we don't want there to be a special set of people to make decisions about what's true. We want that job to be fully decentralized.
So no web of trust that...
No web of trust. The web of trust is everybody. Because otherwise you've got a system which has a center to it, and those centers will always either exploit the hinterland or they'll be exploited by other people that will make them exploit the hinterland. Somebody over here?
Yeah, well, let's put an example, for example, title to the house, right? So I'm selling a house,
Yes.
and I need to move that title. Will that function as the smart contract?
Yes. So questions about titles to the house. In theory, there's no reason you couldn't move physical assets based on a smart contract. So the way that you might do that, and I'm going to wave my arms a little here, so I am not a lawyer. But the way you might do that is you would basically form a company which had a single asset, which was the house, and then the company would state that the beneficiary owner of the house would always be the person who was referred to in a particular smart contract on a particular blockchain. So from the perspective of the legal system, the house is owned by a company. From the perspective of the blockchain, the house is being transferred from one person signs it over to another person with cryptographic key. And the joint between the two is the fact that you're relying on the judge to be able to look at the contracts that manage the house, and I mean legal paper contracts, that manage the house and agree that the reference to the blockchain is valid. Because until you have court systems that are blockchain aware, there's always going to be this problem of you walk into court with a cryptographic key and a bunch of printout, and the judge says, yeah, right. So actually making sure that your property rights on a blockchain apply to anything in the real world is a job for some very cunning lawyering and a bunch of precedent. Good luck to the people who are undertaking this bold work. I wish you the best. Let me know if you need any help. I've been thinking about this for a while. Ian, Greg, and Ricardian contract is your search term for that. And Ian, would love to hear from anybody who wants technical help on implementing this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not a great answer.
I'm just thinking like in peer-to-peer.
Oh, in peer-to-peer stuff, it's fine, but property ownership in our cultures is not defined by peer-to-peer precedents. Property ownership in our cultures is defined by law, and as a result, we're always at the mercy of lawmakers and judges and police, because if they don't understand the agreement between two people, they can always invalidate it and simply assign the property where they think it belongs. So as soon as you start loading physical property into smart contracts and moving it around, you're really taking your chances, because there's always the possibility that they'll just go, we have no idea what that is, it still belongs to the ball. So you exchange a bunch of digital signatures for a hammer, and you think that he should give you the hammer and you're going to sue him for the hammer. Could you explain what digital signature is again? I'm not pretty good at math. You're doomed at that. Right? Jurisdictional hazards on the implementation of smart contracts for physical property are a big deal. This is probably why blockchain stuff will largely remain digital goods for the time being. Question from the guy in the grey shirt, and then we can...
Sure. I don't want to monopolize the questions.
No, please.
Perhaps you've heard about MIT's Enigma project?
I saw the headlines go by, I haven't looked at the paper yet.
So that's distributed computing as well.
Totally like that.
So I'm just wondering how is Ethereum going to compete in a market that keeps moving before you launch?
So this is a really hard question, right? The thing about blockchains is they're intended to be kind of permanent stores of the past. And permanent store of anything means that it doesn't change very quickly, or if it does, it changes in a way that preserves everything that's gone before it. On the other hand, the technical environment moves very, very quickly. Before I came to work for Ethereum, I spent a ton of time talking about how the biggest threat to Bitcoin was not regulators, but its successors. And then, having moved onto the Ethereum team, it's pretty obvious that if Ethereum works, it's not going to be the last step in crypto stuff in the history of history, right? People will look at Ethereum and go, that's pretty clever, but there are a couple of things that they really, really, really should not have done. And then they'll come along and they'll build another system on top of it. So I think that we're in a position where we're going to see continual evolution in these systems until somebody hits something which has the same kind of durability as Visa has. And maybe that something will turn out to be Ethereum, but I would be very overconfident if I suggested that I was sure of that. There's a lot of wait and see.
I was just wondering, imagine that in 5 years Ethereum has proven to be that system that works. What are the antitrust implications for this? Because you're talking about Metropolis as like a web browser that's the only kind of safe web browser to be used, then obviously this has severe policy and antitrust implications, because all the other ones that are behind you would be banned from Ethereum.
Well, I mean, they would be technically incompatible rather than banned.
Well, that's the same thing, right?
Well, okay, so let's think about what the legal status of Ethereum would be in that kind of situation. As a piece of open source software, it doesn't have a single owner, and it's very likely that in that kind of scenario we would have a bunch of different companies that were all producing Ethereum compatible products. So the same way that all of these web browsers run HTML5, you would have Ethereum 1.4, and you'd have a bunch of different technologies that were all compatible with that set of protocols. I think that would probably satisfy regulators, because Ethereum is very much defined as a protocol rather than a product. We've got 3 implementations, one in Python, one in C++, and one in Go, and we do that very specifically to make sure that we're developing a protocol by which things talk to each other, rather than a product which could have only a single implementation, and then when you try and build a second implementation, you discover that it's full of bugs. but the bugs are visible because it's only over top of it. It's a good question. I mean, it's, yeah, how do you become a standard rather than a monopoly? Right. A lot of that has to do with the legal structure, a lot of it has to do with the, a lot of it has to do with the enrollment of fingers. Can you imagine how that would have sounded 10 years ago? What do you mean the computer wants me to enroll my fingers? No, of course. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay, I think, any other questions? Yeah, I'll take 2 or 3 more questions, and then I think there's one more thing that would be fun to think about.
Yeah, just taking clue from your example here, right? That Ethereum has just come, so maybe in few years' time, another similar system or a better system will come up, right? So in this, say, 5 years, few million customers on board, they store their smart contracts, they earn with digital assets, and then there's one more come, and then one more comes.
Yep.
Is there any common foundation, regulatory standard, right, which overseeing all the systems so that there is an agreement of exchange of value across these? Because people like to move across.
Right. So questions about moving across from one standard to another. Right now, we move stuff between Bitcoin and Ethereum using exchanges. So theoretically, remember Ethereum is not live yet, but theoretically there will be individuals who, out of the goodness of their heart, will take your Bitcoin and sell you Ether. Right? Oh, okay, out of the goodness of their 5%, but whatever happens. That becomes a lot more complicated when you start having value in smart contracts, right? Because either every smart contract platform has to be back compatible with all the previous platforms, and you need a protocol by which a smart contract shuts down on one platform, moves across to another platform, and then reopens. Or you wind up with this total mess where the new platform is a reference that says, yeah, if you want to know what the value is of this asset, you've got to go look at this other platform. And I think just nobody has any idea yet. I mean, that's tomorrow's can of worms. You know, it's a really good question. It's really worrying. I have no idea.
Yeah, I would like if you say today's current scenario, right? So MasterCard, Visa, all these guys are there, but there are bodies which kind of ensure coordination among them.
Yes.
Yeah, things move. Yeah, okay.
I mean, it would be nice if Ethereum evolved into a proper global standards body that maintained this kind of stuff. Could happen. It'd be nice if it did.
Sure.
And certainly, you know, the approach we've taken is very, very decentralized, but it does connect very heavily to kind of legitimate structures like, you know, we're a foundation, we intend to stick around to, you know, essentially maintain the technology and all the rest of that kind of stuff. You can imagine that as time passed, if there were multiple implementations and a lot of different users, that could grow into a standards body of a proper kind. You know, if we had 25 different implementations of Ethereum, a standards body to keep the implementations cross-compatible, and all this kind of stuff could evolve out of that. And that would be a kind of best case for the Foundation's future, I think. Somebody back up here. Yes, in the back.
Going back to when he was asking about property,
Yeah.
and you were saying about smart contracts.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you need to have a smart contract for each sale for 2 individuals.
Yes.
So wouldn't it be easier just to do digital identity first?
Identity is a really hard question. I mean, in some ways it's the hardest question, because getting usable, solid identity for people that don't live in countries that provide a strong identity backbone is almost impossible.
But that's the whole point behind digital identity, is to
Well,
activate that.
yeah, I mean, yes, but getting an identity that is robust without state intervention is quite tricky. I mean,
It's the state which also uses it.
So, you know, MasterCard in Nigeria are trying to roll out this scheme where all the Nigerian identity cards will be MasterCard compatible. I still think the issue here is that we don't have good enough biometrics technology to generate unique human identities without also uploading pictures of people's faces. What you really want is a really high quality biometric hash, and right now the algorithms just aren't there for doing that.
Hey Casso exists.
Say again?
Hey Casso, they already do it.
Yeah, but does it work at scale? Is it fast enough?
Well, it works very well. It's already being used in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no systems working on it. I just haven't seen anything that looks like it's the final solution.
So the problem is, if you don't have the identity problem solved, there are certain sorts of legal transactions you cannot complete, like the sale of a house, because there is a state interest in knowing exactly who owns particular things. something else.
Oh, absolutely,
You can,
absolutely.
you can engage in certain types of transactions, but I don't think you can presume that identity. I mean, for me, I would agree. Identity is actually critical to a class of transactions that are beyond.
No, I absolutely agree that identity is critical to a class of transactions, but I think identity is a product.
Why couldn't you just do the KYC? Sorry, Nate. Why couldn't you just do the KYC that applies to the jurisdiction that you are?
Exactly.
Precisely.
It's all under the jurisdiction control, but you're going over a decentralized blockchain.
Well, I mean, there's no problem with lodging. There's no problem with lodging KYC credentials on a blockchain, right? So if I go to my bank and my bank is adequately sure of who I am, they can give me a certificate stating that this digital key is connected to this human being with this KYC record that's sitting in the bank. So my notion would be that you would have blockchain users who would then go to their banks and get KYC'd on the blockchain for the applications that require it.
But you then have a problem like with Turkey. You cannot actually take any form of information of KYC outside of Turkey, so you put it on the blockchain.
Look,
and
if you're going to go to
South Korea,
if you're going to go to the state, you're always going to have this problem, right? The states don't always like each other; they're not always compatible with each other. But if you're going to do completely solid identification of persons without going through the state, you're always going to have a whole bunch of fishiness with the biometrics on the bottom of the pipe.
But that also comes forward with the property sales as well, because that information cannot be the jurisdiction as well.
We manage that kind of cross-jurisdictional sale of property all the time. The problem is poor jurisdictions where you don't have a state platform for identity. I mean, what I see as being a permanent solution to that is high-quality, cheap DNA scans, so that you can use really fundamental biological indicators to get identity, but then you need the ability to hash that stuff securely. And right now, all of those technologies are still completely rubbery. They're just not here.
And we need enrollment, and there is a privacy issue.
Oh, the privacy issues are amazing.
I mean, I just really want to see Americans submitting their DNA.
Yeah,
Well,
so does the American government.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I think one last question.
Well, just a technical question for Ethereum. Is this the one network, or is the platform you can develop different instances of the network?
It is the one network. I mean, we've had a series of test networks, but when we ship it, that's it. That's going to sort of value. There are some open questions about whether or not we're going to have to do weird stuff to the network in the process of moving from proof of work to proof of stake. The best idea I've heard about that so far is that the two systems run in parallel for a year or so, and once we're sure that they always come to the same conclusion every time, the proof of work drops out and the proof of stake continues. But that is almost certainly next year's concern. 8 o'clock, good time to wind up. Thank you.
We have more time.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
What's the difference between NXT and Ethereum?
Good question. I have not looked over NXT in detail.
Because your functionalities are exactly the same as NXT, which has been running for 2 years.
Well, you
How many people?
You can't run smart contract.
No, the reason why they don't put the smart contracts in is because it's bulky on the blockchain. That's why they do pruning on the messaging.
Which explains the main difference between
Yeah, I mean, we're a smart
Smart
contract.
contracts are there. You can do them, it takes 2 seconds.
But you don't have the space for it.
No, you don't want to have the space. That's the point why they've not added it, because it chews up the blockchain.
So it's not optimized for smart contracts, that's what you're saying.
You cannot, they have pruning, they have actual blockchain pruning.
Right.
So they can do it, but the need is not there.
Ethereum is very explicitly a smart contract platform. I mean, we are all about smart contracts. But, I mean, we are sort of in this let 1,000 flowers bloom phase of blockchain development. I mean, Tendermint is out there, there's all the counterparty stuff. I mean, every time we turn over a rock, there's some bunch of smart guys who are beavering away in the corner cranking out another blockchain technology. Right now, I think Ethereum is fairly clearly a front runner because we were heavily funded and we've got an amazing team. But how long that will stay true, how long is Google going to be the dominant search engine? It's all very, very, very slippery because we're going up a technological gradient that looks like this. And at any given point, you never know what's going to just kind of zoom past you. But the price of doing this kind of technology development is that you're always in a position where the risk is the guys coming behind you forward, and you either take your shot in the lead or you don't play. Yeah.
What type of decentralized application you're anticipating to go and jump into your platform?
Sorry, I missed 3
What
words
type
at
of
the end.
decentralized application you're anticipating to jump into your platform
Well,
initially?
so the front runners right now, the things that are kind of our poster children, there's a thing decentralized prediction market. So, you know, you think that Argentina will win the World Cup, you put a bunch of money behind that, a bunch of other people say it will be Germany, they put some money behind that. If you are right and they are wrong, you get their money. Super simple.
Gambling then.
Yeah. Well, well, yes and no. Right?
Derivative.
So,
so now we go for rocking, right? Is the license for it?
well, hang on. So prediction markets, right, have a good long academic history of being used to guess what will happen in future events. So, for example, there's, I think it's the Iowa prediction market, where people basically bet against each other on the outcome of future presidential elections. And that's specially licensed by the US government, and it very successfully predicts who will win elections. So there are lots and lots and lots of academic studies on using these markets as general tools for doing prediction of the future, because it turns out that the confidence to put money behind your bet and people who've done real research and have a good idea of what will happen are strongly correlated. So the idea of Augur is to provide a generic platform for prediction markets, which will allow experts to make their living taking money off markets. So we could get a ton of high-quality expertise about the future, organised in a format where these people can make a living by knowing what will happen. Now, is that gambling? Yeah, kind of. But it's not just rolling the dice, it's gambling on an outcome that you can't control in an environment where you're using your skill to figure out what the future will hold in an abstracted way. So I would say it's paying people for research in using the mechanisms of gambling. Of course, some people will.
So you're describing Napster to iTunes money, basically.
Pardon?
You're describing Napster to iTunes.
I don't understand.
Well, you're going from one part, jumping very far forward.
Yeah.
Can't control it.
Yeah.
In which HSBC is waiting to pay a 2-digit billing figure for blockchain technology based on that money.
Oh, the number of people circling this entire space with checkbooks that are basically like 9-digit bank balances is enormous. Anybody in the financial sector who's not seriously looking at blockchains is like people not looking at databases in 1976 or not looking at the web in 1994. I mean, we're at that moment where the next Amazon is being founded somewhere on blockchain right now. And all the regulatory stuff you're talking about, I can't even imagine how they're going to approach that. Right? Fortunately, it's not my concern. I mean, there's just, I just can't imagine how you approach regulatory stuff. Find a jurisdiction that gives you full support and pray. I mean, we as a platform vendor, we are neutral to what our users do. We have to be. Lots of people running gambling sites on the internet. The backbone providers are not responsible. Apache Software Foundation is not responsible for what people do with the Apache web server. Similarly, we are not responsible for what people do with the Ethereum network. Their business what they do. The other really nice thing that we've got cooking is a thing called provenance. Right? And the provenance folks are interested in the way that blockchain supply chains strip information off when they move. So the product is made in some factory in China, and as it moves towards its eventual consumer somewhere in America, we throw away information all the time until it arrives as a shiny, anonymous package with no history at all. Right? Where did it come from? Where was it in transit? Who manufactured its components? Who designed it? All of that stuff is just washed out of a lot of the supply chain until we wind up with a sterile object. And it leaves a lot of really important questions unanswered. What is this made of? Where did it come from? Is there anything toxic inside of it? Was it manufactured in an environment with appropriate labour protection? So the provenance folks want to basically wrap products in their stories so that the story is preserved as the product moves up the supply chain, so that when you finally buy the thing, you can get the entire history of it right back to its point of origin. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. They're planning on starting with kind of luxury goods that have a story which people are willing to pay to know, like, hand-knitted sweater by an Icelandic grandmother kind of territory. But their ambition is to go into electronics and food as fast as the market will condition itself to allow them. I think those are both absolutely knockout projects. Okay, one or two more, and then let's wrap this show up. Yes?
So I'm wondering about the hard disk storage. If you have so right now the blockchain is stored by full nodes, is it? Yeah. So which means that if it grows and I want to run it locally, I will have to come up with an increasing amount of gigabytes, terabytes to store it locally, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the Bitcoin blockchain is currently, what, 20 meg or something? 20 gig or something?
The Bitcoin blockchain is, yeah.
About 20 gig. So the price of 20 gig of hard drive storage, assuming that you're buying a 2 terabyte drive, is probably 10 cents, something like
But
that.
that's the same blockchain where you said that it moves 2 transactions a second, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it moves 1,000 times faster, you also and you want to store program information, so it's going to be a lot larger, I presume.
So let's take this in 2 phases. So blockchain scaling, the Ethereum network might be 10 times the speed of the Bitcoin network. It might even be 20 times the speed, but it's going to be an incremental speed up rather than a proper revolution. Computer sure 20 times speed up is incremental. So at that point, you might wind up having, if you want full chain storage, you might wind up with $100 worth of hard drive that just stores the blockchain. That's acceptable. If you're going to be mining, you're going to have several $100s worth of graphics cards. If you also require $100 a hard drive, it's fine. Once we get to blockchain scaling, the question of how aggressively you prune the blockchain and what you need to store where becomes one of the really major technical challenges, because you might well wind up with, do you know the term OLTP, online transaction processing? It's the enormous data clearing houses that places like Visa use to just shuttle transactions through their networks. So you begin to wind up with OLTP type problems, which is a whole bunch of really serious rocket science that blockchain land has not yet had to acquire. So as we get to massive transaction volumes, we're going to need to get expertise in from other fields, and that is probably going to be OLTP people. And welcome to innovation. Yeah, we can see that problem's coming. Somebody will figure it out. Or the network will get really slow and expensive, right? But that notion of we have all the answers and we've worked all of this out. Hell no, right? And this is really seriously bleeding edge stuff. Every time I come out and talk about it.
recently wrote a paper on this.
Pardon?
Lieutenant recently wrote a paper about pruning the blockchain and
Oh yeah,
introducing it all.
absolutely, right? But until I see a working implementation, man, it's all guesswork.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Right? It's all guesswork. And I mean, my feeling about all of this stuff, every time I come out and talk about Ethereum, it's like, talking about the web in like 93. Oh, look at this thing, look at this thing. This thing's going to be really amazing. One day it's going to change everything. And you always have that sense of like, are we sure? Right? Well, it seems that way. And that feeling of like the uncertainty and the things, the uncertainties which don't resolve when you think about them really hard, that to me is the smell of the actual edge. Like, I've had that a few times in my life. I've been lucky enough to work on things which were genuinely bang on the edge. And Ethereum is really, like, it is the biggest edge that I've ever looked over. Like, are we really going to jump? And, it's really exciting. But what it goes with is you get into these areas where there are just enormous unknowns. What if the network is really successful? How are you going to probe? And that's exactly where we are, right? I mean, if you get the technical team talking rather than me, their versions are a little more detailed, right? You've got Vitalik's white paper, right? That's a very sophisticated. Probably like this. Let's write it down, write the software and see if it works in a year. Right? And that's where this stuff really is. It's the absolute excitement of like, we are this close. And that's where we are. Right, one last question and then let's wrap it. Sir?
If you'd get $100 million now and the obligation to stop with Ethereum and do something else, what would you do?
With $100 million, I think I could probably figure out something that builds on top of Ethereum as a worthy successor.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, remember that we're not a company, right? We're a charity. So we don't have equity in Ethereum. A lot of people have been looking at Ether as a speculative commodity that they expect to rise like Bitcoin. I think that's actually fairly unlikely. Right? We make it so incredibly easy to create instruments that store value, which are not Ether. I think we might wind up with 500 different currencies on top of Ethereum, and people will use Ether to pay what amounts to web hosting bills. They'll use it to pay for the utility functions of the network. But I think it's entirely possible that Ether will simply wind up as a sort of thing that people use in $100 or $200 quantities on a regular basis, rather than something that becomes this enormous ramp and kind of store of value. But I don't know. I mean, we literally just have no idea what the real user behavior don't know whether money will pile in from Bitcoin, we don't know whether it will pile in from fiat, we don't know how much demand there will be for the network. I mean, as a sort of notion, right? If we saw